What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, we are going to talk about stats, right? Don't turn off. I know a lot of you hate stats. This isn't going to be a sales pitch or anything like this. I'm not going to ram it down your throats and say that you absolutely have to do this. But we're in a position in FPL right now where there's a little bit of a break until the next game, a little bit of a break till the next deadline. And we really need the fixtures confirmed either way. Whatever happens with the fixtures, right? We need them for game week 22 before we can talk about them in more detail, right? So I thought we would do something that's kind of more evergreen and something that's more useful going forward for the rest of this season and next season, right? It doesn't mean that you have to use just stats. You can still watch football, right? It's perfectly allowed, but I just wanted to talk about through kind of how I do it and why I use them quite regularly and how you might assess players and stuff like that. So if you do enjoy it, give it a like, hit that subscribe button if you're new around here. Let's jump into it. So let's talk about first of all why I like stats, right? And the first thing is they tend to be objective. As long as you are using very similar stats for different players, right, and you're not changing the parameters, then they should be objective, okay? So I tend to use expected data. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. We're going to talk about kind of why I use that, what the common arguments are, then some player comparisons and how I would kind of think about which player I'm selecting from a different team and all that stuff later on in the video. But for the most part, they should be objective. Now, you have to be careful because you'll see stats banded around, and for one player, they'll use one set of stats, and for a different player, it'll be a different set of stats. For one player, it'll be the last 4 weeks. The next player, it'll be the last 6 weeks. I tend to use per 90 minutes because it kind of puts players on an even keel, although you have to use context, right, which I'll come on to in a second. So if I'm looking at expected goals per 90 minutes for this season, for Saka versus Foden versus Ronaldo versus De Bruyne versus Harry Kane, they're all being based on the same stats. Now, I know one of the arguments is that not all players finish the same and stuff like that, but we'll come on to that a little bit later. But for the most part, they're objective. And then it also makes it very easy to compare players. Now, you might say it doesn't matter. I watch a lot of football. That's absolutely fine. But most people, I would say, don't watch 10 matches every single week for the Premier League. And even if you do watch all 10 matches for 90 minutes, what about if a different player from another league comes in? You haven't also watched all of their league matches as well. Maybe you only need highlights to see how good a player is, and that's fair enough. But if you're just watching highlights, you're only seeing what the broadcaster wants you to see, right? There might be some context, right? One of the arguments against is always that stats don't provide enough context. Well, neither does watching highlights, right? To really get a proper eye test, surely you'd have to watch the player for the whole game and also watch all other 9 games for 90 minutes just to compare other players, right? So it's very easy to compare players because you've got a bunch of numbers in front of you. So for example, right, I went on Google and I just Googled young talents in Ligue 1, right? And this is Jonathan David, and I've also got Kevin Volland as well, just to do a quick comparison, right? So I've very rarely seen these players play, possibly not ever seen them play. I don't remember any matches from them at all. So it's very hard for me to compare them to what a player in the Premier League might be like. And again, there's going to be arguments that Ligue 1 is easier. I get that, okay? But both these players are playing in Ligue 1 right now. So Jonathan David, straight away, this is on fbref.com. So I can come down here. There's a bunch of numbers on here. Again, if you're just using expected data, then you can scroll all the way along. I always use per 90 minutes. Again, you have to put some context around it, right? If a player is not playing very often, then they're not necessarily a good FPL asset, right? Even if their per 90 numbers are good. So there's all that kind of thing to think about. But you look at this here and you can see straight away, is expected goals and expected assists together at 0.5 last season. This season it's 0.63. Now that to me is the signs of a pretty good player, right? Now, just because that looks good in Ligue 1 doesn't mean they're going to come to the Premier League and necessarily just smash it, but it gives me a good indication of how good that player is. And again, I can go to someone else. This is Kevin Volland. I've probably pronounced that wrong. I apologise. But we come over here, and again, he's got a history of being a pretty good player by the looks of these numbers here on the left. And again, to get into an FPL point of view, right, goals are worth more than assists. So expected goals, if that is higher than your expected assists, happy days. For defenders, maybe it matters a little bit less because they're not going to get a huge amount of returns anyway. But ultimately, goals are better, right? So this is what you want to look at. And you can see for this season, it's come down a bit. Maybe that's age. Maybe that's just, I don't know, the way Monaco are playing. Again, I'd have to look into it for a bit more context if I really wanted an in-depth view of why this has happened. Maybe it's because they're only halfway through the season. Maybe the second half of the season will be much better. But having that kind of background of the last few seasons is really helpful, right? Larger data samples are better. But ultimately, using the same again, expected goals, expected assists, makes it quite easy to compare players. And you can also assess players pretty quickly. Now, again, just looking at a bunch of numbers on a screen doesn't necessarily tell you everything you need to know. But for FPL, it probably tells you enough for the most part, right? You can watch a player's body language, how they're fitting into the team and stuff like that. But if the numbers kind of tell you a different story, you might have to question what your eye test is actually telling you. Maybe you've got it slightly wrong. Maybe the stats are sometimes wrong. But again, at least you are comparing players on an even kind of path, right? An even playing field. Playing field, right? Nice pun there. But there is some stuff, right? You have to use context. So again, it's all well and good comparing per 90 minutes. But if a player's come off the bench kind of 3 or 4 times and scored a goal in the last 10 minutes, right? 4 games in a row, and they've only had like 1 shot or something like that, but it was a really good expected goal shot right in the 6-yard box. There's context around that, right? So it's good position to be scoring goals in. You want your player to be scoring goals closer to goal, right? Because it's easier to do. But the chances are they're probably not going to keep that up. You want to see like a bigger spread of games and stuff like that as well. So it's not that stats are perfect, but you have to always kind of provide context. So when we come on to player comparisons in a minute, we're going to look at per 90 minutes for Man City midfielders. But obviously there's massive context around that about who's actually going to start every week. Because if a player let's say, I don't know, if a player's got 0.8 expected goals per 90 or something like that. That's very high, by the way. I picked a really bad number. But they only play once every other game. That's not maybe as good as someone with 0.5 that's going to play both games in a row, right? So I have to put context around it. And yeah, when I say they're not perfect, expected data probably is the best prediction tool we have. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a player is suddenly going to score a specific amount of goals. This is football, right? We're just trying to see who the best option is, right? And all the time in FPL, you'll buy a player you think is great and they just don't perform for a set amount of game, which you get really frustrated. That is football. Look at Harry Kane. A few of us got him instead of Son weeks ago. Son returned, Kane didn't. Now Kane is returning perfectly fine as well. So that just happens in football. So it's not like if a player gets 5 expected goals and doesn't score any of them, it doesn't mean that the next 5 games they're going to score 5, right? A goal every game. It just doesn't work like that. But they are probably the best prediction that we have for future returns. And I actually find that I think not all the time, but it does stop me tilting. And tilting, I think, is a term, again, from poker. I've talked about it before, where when things go against you, you start making bad decisions. I find that when I use stats, because I feel like I'm ultimately trying to make the best decision I can. If it goes wrong, I can almost just say, okay, fair enough. I feel like I did make a good decision. It didn't pay off. How are the numbers looking now? How has that player been looking on the pitch? Are they getting good chances and stuff like that? Do I need to just keep them a little bit longer? What are the fixtures looking like? Saka, I think, is a prime example of that. This season, he was really poor for me. His stats were looking better than Smith Rowe. He was absolutely nailed. That's why I bought him. And he just didn't perform. And then people were saying, well, you need to sell him, you need to sell him. And then I kept him and he got 6 returns in 6. Now, ultimately, you'd rather those returns were a bit more spread out over time, but it just doesn't always work like that. So I find in some situations it stops me tilting on players. You just don't feel like the luck's always against you. You just realise that sometimes things don't work out how you want. But if you keep making the decisions in the same way, ultimately, later on, hopefully, you'll get the returns. Although I would say it doesn't always work like that. All right, just a quick few things on why a lot of people now use expected data, right? Especially for FPL. There's loads and loads of different stats that you could use, but how many are actually relevant to FPL? There probably isn't that many, right? I saw when Mason Greenwood got taken off the other day, and I said, he's been good, but I don't think he's really caused Wolves that many problems. People started throwing me the stats that Sky had put on screen, which were like most dribbles attempted and touches in the box. That's not necessarily causing problems, right? You want players in good positions. And this is not a dig at Mason Greenwood. I'm not saying that he didn't play well. I'm just saying that some stats, especially for FPL purposes, are pretty meaningless. So expected data, especially like expected goals, incorporates other stats. You don't necessarily need to look at shots in the box or shots on target or distance of shots or shot heat maps and stuff like that. Expected goals kind of takes that all into account. And if you use something like FBref as well, it takes into account like defender positioning and goalkeeper positioning, because that's obviously important for how likely a goal was to be scored. And you might say it's not the forward's fault for the defender to be in the way, but a player's decision making or being able to get into the best positions, obviously a key indicator of whether that can continue to happen over a long period of time. Again, it's always the same comparison. So if you're using expected goals, expected assists per 90 minutes, one player versus another in the league, right? It's all fairly the same. Although obviously there is some context around what matches that they played, right? If you're comparing them after just 4 games of the season, well, they've probably had different fixtures, right? Over a whole season, which is why we like large data samples, at least they've played theoretically every team twice, although obviously injury, suspensions and stuff like that come into account. I think it's fairly simple, right? If you're only using a couple of stats to compare different players, right? If you haven't seen them play or you've not seen as many matches as you wanted, it's fairly simple to compare players, right? And then you can look at fixture difficulty as well, which again we'll come on to later. There's lots and lots of research which says it's the best predictor of future goals or future returns, right? And a lot of people talk about form and stuff like that, which we'll come on to in a minute. But expected data tends to be the best predictor. And goals and assists is what we want, right? We don't really care who's dribbling here, who's dribbling there, who's got the most interceptions, blocks and stuff like that. It doesn't really matter for FPL. To a certain small degree, it matters for bonus points. But realistically, it's goals and assists is what we want. That's why I use expected goals, expected assists, best indicators. All right, let's run through some kind of common arguments against using stats and against using expected data in particular, right? So one of the common ones is they're just a good finisher, okay? You see that a lot. So a player, and Smith Rowe and Bernardo Silva are perfect examples of this. There's other players as well. I don't have an agenda against either of these players. They're just fresh in the mind because it's happened recently, right? So you'll see a player will massively outscore their expected goals, or their underlying stats are just not that great, and they'll score loads of goals, and then you have 2 conversations on Twitter. One person will say they can't keep this up, and the other person will usually come back and say maybe they're just a good finisher, maybe they're in form, maybe they just got a lot of confidence, something like that, right? But generally, a player will not outscore their expected goals over a long period of time, right? Especially not by double, which is basically what's happening with Smith Rowe right now, okay? The guy's good, right? Arsenal should be very happy they've got him. He's a great backup player right now. When he gets back into the team, he's had a really good season. He does a lot of things well, but we are only talking this from an FPL perspective. How good of an FPL option is he? And I'm going to come on to Bernardo Silva as well in a minute. So this season so far, if you can see here where my mouse is, where I've highlighted, he's had 3.4, let me just tick that, 3.4 expected goals, okay? But he's actually scored 8 goals. That's more than double his expected goals. Now, you might say he's just a good finisher, but no player keeps that up where they outscore their expected goals by double. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's a bad option going forward, right? You can come over and look at his underlying data, his per 90 minutes, and to me, that does say that it's not that good. If you got him for 5.3 million, you're probably happy as, but you wouldn't necessarily pay the same prices for Saka, for example. But ignoring that for now, we're coming on to the 8 goals from 3.4. So the common argument is he's just a good finisher, right? Maybe just a better finisher than everyone else. But then you look at someone like Jamie Vardy. I think most people, if you ask them whether Jamie Vardy is a good finisher, they would say yes. One of the common kind of memes and stuff in the FPL community is that Jamie Vardy is a stats buster. But he's not really, right? So if we come down to look at his stats, and again, it's not taking away anything from Jamie Vardy. He's a brilliant forward, probably one of the best the league's ever seen, right? This season, he scored 9 goals from 6.2. Now, if you look at what Smith Rowe's done, that should be more like 12, right? Double. Last season, he had 19.7 expected goals, and he only scored 15. So he actually underperformed on his expected data. The year before, it was 23 from 20. The year before that, it was 18 from 17.6. This is a player that is seen in the community as a good finisher, as he should be, but actually he doesn't really massively outperform his expected goals. So that tells me for Smith Rowe, this is also not going to continue. But you then make a bet about when that's going to happen. Just because he scored 8 goals from 3.4, I can sit here and say that's not going to continue, and it absolutely won't. But I also don't know exactly when it's going to stop. So you have to make a bet of when that's going to happen. So right now, Smith Rowe has still been banging in the goals, and it makes you look really stupid. But then for another player like Bernardo Silva, you say the same thing, and it's like, well, he's not going to continue it, and he didn't straight away. So I feel like if you always make the decisions in a similar way, yes, you're going to miss out on some players, but you're also going to avoid some players that are just not going to keep up their performances, right? All players aren't the same. Yeah, this one comes in all the time, right? If expected data gives, 0.5 chance that you're going to score this goal from this position, Obviously, Salah is more likely to score that than Phil Jones, okay? But again, that doesn't mean that the stats are meaningless. It just means you've got to put some context around it. And again, you can come onto FBref and you can go to Mo Salah, right? We can put him in and look at him. And you can see how often he has outperformed his expected goals. So last season, 22 goals from 20.9. The season before, 19 from 19.4. So again, he's not massively outperforming it either, but that shows that he's a pretty good finisher. I'm sure if I went and looked at the same stats for Phil Jones, it's probably not as good. So we know that players aren't all the same, but we can use the stats to tell us how good of a finisher a player is. So again, the Salah one goes to show most players do not outscore their expected goals for long periods of time, right? That's why we say this can't continue. You just take a bet on whether or not you have to go for the player. Like there's arguments to be made around effective ownership and blocking other players. Like if a player reaches a huge ownership and you don't think the point's going to continue, in some scenarios you should probably still bring them in to stop your rank being battered every single week. But that's a different conversation, right? Eye test is better, maybe, but then it goes back to what I said before, that you can't watch hundreds and hundreds of games to compare different players. It's just impossible. Form, my one question for people that say just use form: what is form? When does it start and when does it end, right? Harry Kane a few weeks ago, out of form, didn't want to be at the club, was never going to perform again. We shouldn't bring him in. Now he scored some goals. Is he now back in form? What's changed between those kind of set few game weeks? Not a lot, really. He's a quality player. We can see that in the stats. The fixtures are there. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right? That is just FPL. That is just football. And we don't have we don't have time for large samples. Fair enough, but especially for players like Salah and Vardy and that, we can see back over a long period of time what their stats are. And again, for example, if I just really quickly show the Smith Rowe example again, we can see that his stats this year are 0.37, so they slightly improved. But we know from last season they weren't really that much better, right? So we can see that for a lot of players. That is your large data sample size. So there's a lot of arguments for whether or not you should use them. I think a lot of these, they're not bad arguments, but I think there's always a counter for most of them. Okay, so here's a little example of how you could assess some players, right? So these numbers are all taken from FBref, okay? The first column is their expected goal involvement for this year. The second column is expected goal involvement for last year. Now, that is important because sometimes, especially over a smaller sample, maybe a player's only played 5-10 games, their numbers could be sky high. Looking at kind of last season's data and the season before that, just to see what their average stats are looking like, you can see just what the chances are of keeping it up. So Foden, for example, out of this world so far this season, 0.84 expected goal involvement. That's super high. There's probably not a huge amount of players in the world that are better than that on a consistent level. And then you think, okay, that's much higher than last year. So there probably is the potential for those numbers to come down. But his base level from last year is pretty good, right? So you'd put him quite high up. Bernardo Silva, on the other hand, only 0.4 this year so far. That is the same as every other... that is worse than every other Man City midfielder that I've listed here. And then you might think, well, that could go up. But then you look at last season, it's 0.28. So is it likely to go miles up? Is he likely to improve that much? Probably not. And that is why people were saying he's not going to keep it up. Obviously, if you've got Bernardo Silva at the start of that 5 game week period where he got 5 goals, absolutely really happy. But if you miss that, you shouldn't then think, well, I've got to go and get those points. You have to reassess the next player you're bringing in. And to me, objectively, right, even if you watch the games, and to me, Foden's always closer to goal for a larger period of games than Bernardo Silva is. But if you're not sure, or you haven't watched like the last 10 Man City games to see exactly what's happened, you can use these stats to kind of tell you. And to me, it just shows that Foden is objectively a better player for FPL. We're not talking in real life. Bernardo Silva's had a great season. I think he's actually probably been Man City's standout player so far this year. But from an FPL point of view, we want goals, we want assists. And objectively, Foden looks like he has a much better chance of doing that. But of course, when we're assessing players... for Man City, it's easy because they're always going to face the same opposition because they're on the same team. For other players, you'd have to assess fixture difficulty as well, which we'll come on to in a sec. But for this, as long as they're going to play a similar amount of minutes, Foden is miles better than Bernardo Silva. But of course, it comes back to that context conversation. If you've got a player that's much closer, like Gundogan 0.65, well, his minutes right now are really bad. So I don't think you can say that Gundogan is a better option than Bernardo Silva right now for FPL. You can say that Gundogan's a better option when they both play, like if they were both going to play 90 minutes, if De Bruyne got injured or something like that. But right now, you cannot say he's a better option just because the numbers show that he is. But for Foden, when he's fit and available, he's been starting a lot. Therefore, he is a better option. Mahrez, he's another player that we always say, if he was nailed on, he'd always be in our teams. And rightfully so. His numbers are really good. So this is how I like comparing players. If I'm not sure, if I haven't watched enough matches, like sometimes you'll just know, right? You know that if Spurs are about to play Norwich, then Watford, then Newcastle, then Burnley in a row, you know that Son and Kane are great options. You don't need to go and look at stats, but sometimes it can be really useful. And this is why I haven't bought Bernardo Silva this season. Not yet, anyway. All right, so I also want to talk about fixture difficulty, because you will hear me a lot of times say that a defence is really good or better than another team. And some people will turn around and say, well, the goal difference or the goals against and the league table tell you a different story. But again, like using expected goals and expected assists to predict instead of using goals and assists, we're doing the same with kind of fixture difficulty as well. So again, you can come to competitions at the top, then Premier League, and then you have to go to squad and player stats, then standard stats, and then you want opponent. If you're looking at the attack, a team's attack, then you just leave it on squad stats. If you want to look at a team's defense, you go to opponent stats, and then I always go on per 90 minutes, okay? And I know this is a lot to follow, right? But then you go to expected data, which is here. So non-penalty expected goals. This is conceded, basically. This is the same as conceded. So straight away, and again, I'm not trying to like tell you the obvious, right? Watford, Leeds, Newcastle, Norwich, Burnley, they are the worst defences so far this season. You could have probably told me that without seeing the stats, right? I fully get that. But this tells you just how bad they are. 1.52 expected goals conceded, 1.53, 1.6. What's interesting then is other teams. So sometimes I will say things on videos, and maybe I need to make it more clear why, but I'll say like, oh, that's not a bad fixture, or I wouldn't worry about having a player against them. They could even be a captaincy opportunity. And this is why Salah was a great captain against Leicester, because they are the 6th worst team so far this season for expected goals conceded. And again, you know, if you wanted to get more in depth around this, there's people to follow on Twitter. Maybe I'll put some of their names in the description who will be able to tell you how you should look at this, because you've got to take into account previous season's data and stuff like that to get a better view. But this season so far, Leicester, really bad. Everton haven't been much better. They are next after them, 1.45. Then it's Southampton. Then it's Man United. Like, Man United defence hasn't been great. Those of us that bought in De Gea, maybe we made a big mistake there. Maybe we did, right? Arsenal defence, Man United defence hasn't been good. Arsenal defence hasn't been great, although obviously recently it's been doing well. I think what's more interesting is just how good some teams are. Like, how good Man City are. 0.65 expected goals conceded. That is like better than double what Man United is, 1.36, right? So Man City defence is class. Chelsea's defence is the second best. Obviously, again, you've got to put context around it. They're missing James. They're missing Chilwell. Kante and Kovacic haven't been fit recently. Obviously, they are now. Then it's Spurs, who, bearing in mind, this is over the season, have got a slightly better expected goals conceded than Liverpool, right? So it shows just what a good job Conte is doing. Then it's Palace, then it's Brighton. So again, you'll hear me say like Brighton is actually a fairly difficult fixture. So the way I would use this is, I mean, you can start going into kind of multipliers and stuff like that. I'm not going to go that in depth in this because I don't really understand it. But if you've got like Salah and Ronaldo as your two captain choices, then you can look at their individual numbers, where I think Salah's a little bit higher without going to double check. Also, Salah's a midfielder, so he gets extra points for goals and stuff like that. And then you can come onto here to get a realistic look of how difficult a fixture it is. So if Ronaldo's playing Brighton and Salah's playing Leicester, well, Salah's definitely the better option, right? If it's the other way around, then maybe it's a bit closer, right? Salah's maybe not going to have a great time against Brighton, but we know how good Liverpool are. We know how good Salah is. We probably should still captain him. But take this week, for example, when Salah's gone to African Cup of Nations. If you're comparing, say, Harry Kane and Cristiano Ronaldo, you can go and look at their own individual underlying numbers, and then you can come here and see just how difficult that team really is. Because I think sometimes we get so set in our ways about how good a team is, and we know Leicester can be good, but right now this season they haven't been good. We shouldn't necessarily see that as a really bad fixture. I'm not saying we should see it as easy as Leeds, as easy as Watford, as easy as Norwich, but we should definitely see it as like a much easier game than Brighton right now. That is why I said on Twitter for Everton, the attackers have got an easier game against Leicester than they do against Brighton, but the defence has just had their better game because Leicester, like if you go to squad stats and you look at per 90 minutes for expected goals, this is 4, so this is for their attack. Leicester are the 4th best attack so far this season. Brighton are right down the bottom. So Brighton are a bad team to face if you've got an attacker, but they're a good team to face if you've got a defender because they don't score a huge amount of goals. So that is how I would use fixture difficulty to kind of decide which teams I want my players to kind of face every single game week. So there you go. That is my slightly longer than intended stats video. Tell me if you're converted, right? Tell me if you've got any other questions that you want me to try and answer. Leave them in the comments below. I know like it's a lot to take in, especially if you don't use them that regularly. And look, I'm not saying I'm an expert or anything like that, right? There's lots of people out there who could explain this probably a little bit better. I'm going to put a really good article in the description below that talks through a little bit more from Sertalp. I hope I've pronounced that right. I'll put his Twitter link in the description below as well. But yeah, I just want to do something a little bit different because obviously we're waiting around for the fixtures. Like I've just seen that Liverpool have temporarily closed their first team training facility. So there's lots of stuff happening there where they might not play Arsenal in the Carabao Cup when they were supposed to, and therefore that might create different fixtures in the Premier League. So until we've got the fixtures, there's not a huge amount of regular content I can do. So let me know if there's anything else you want to see that aren't involving double game weeks and fixtures because we just don't have it right now. Otherwise, I'll leave it there. Give it a like if you enjoyed it. Hit that subscribe button and I'll see you again soon.